So, good morning, everyone. My name's Sue Garner. Thank you for joining us today for our IPLS iPrimary Maths feedback on the 2023 papers. We're going to take a look at the summer 2023 papers, and then at the end we're going to have a look and see how some of the questions actually worked differently in November, which was a bit of a surprise on some questions, but we'll get to that at the end. So we're going to have a look at some of the areas of iPrimary Maths, identify some of the strengths and weaknesses that we see coming through, hopefully identify some areas in centres that you can work on, hopefully to get some higher achievements in the future. So during the session, if you have any questions, if you feel you have anything you want to ask, or if there's something that you need an answer to, can we please use the chat facility this morning? I am running the meeting alone, so I don't have a co-host, so won't necessarily be able to answer questions instantly as they come up, but we can have a look at those when we get to the end, or we will provide a feedback to the questions asked when we provide the copy of the presentation after the meeting. So anything you want to ask, if we use the chat facility, I have that available and can see it. Okay, so in this session, we're going to be looking at how we can use the examiner's report to identify some of the areas of the specification that require more teaching or ideas for improvement in achievement. We're going to look at topics which perform well, so they were well answered, and then we're going to follow it up looking at some of the areas where we get weaker responses. We'll look at examples of questions from summer 2023, along with some bits of the relevant mark scheme, and to see how and where the marks can be gained and awarded. Some of the comments from the principal examiner's report and statistics we will have a look at as well. So, iPrimary Maths, a little bit of breakdown as to how we use the paper. So iPrimary Maths is divided into two sections. We have section A. This section is a multiple choice section, comes with 20 questions. Each question is worth 1 mark, and each question has 4 options for students to choose from. Each time only one option is correct, and I will spend a fair bit of time this morning talking about making sure the answers are marked correctly onto the script. It's something that we do see some students losing marks on. I'll come to that when we get to it in more detail. So section A, 20 marks, followed by section B, which is made up of 40 marks. There's around 15 questions, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on how they're split into part A's and part B's. These questions are to be worked out with answers to be written out, so more in the style that we would expect from an examination paper as we move through education. Many of these questions are single mark questions. The specification requires that 6 to 8 of them are 2 mark questions. So we're expecting, even at this level, that students are showing some method and able to gain some method marks. 1 or 2 of the questions on the paper will be 3 mark questions. The final question is always a 3 mark problem solving question, where we're expecting students to do a little bit more thinking to work out where they're going to pull their information from and to how to solve the problem. The remaining 20 marks on the paper are single marks, quite straightforward questions that just progress obviously in difficulty. So we mentioned multiple choice questions in section A. Even though section A is multiple choice, we do still accept working out. We just need to ensure that these are recorded correctly on the script so that they are marked. At the end of every examination period, once we've had all the statistics out and we've awarded the grade boundaries, we provide a principal examiner's report. The same as anything we provide at IGCSE and any other examinations. Every assessment that we provide a report by the principal examiner. At the end of it, this report is extremely useful. It identifies the areas on a whole across the whole cohort which need to be focused on going forward, and which need and also which questions performed well. So quite regularly, the principal examiner's report for section A tells us section A is always a 20-question multiple choice section, each question worth 1 mark. In this section, students choose from 4 given answers. Then I've highlighted the next section. We've noticed recently where some of the students are losing marks. So students are expected to put a cross in the box below their selected choice. It's essential that students are practiced and understand the importance of this skill. The questions are, these first 20 questions are computer marked, and answers left as a written response can't be picked up by the computer, so the marks are being missed out on. Students continue to do very well in this section, especially on the more straightforward questions, which is nice to see. As I say, this has been picked up recently as we've been looking at where marks are being lost, and it's something I'm going to spend some time on looking at right now. So section B of the principal examiner's report goes through a breakdown question by question. Feedback's given and discusses key points for each of the topics assessed. Some statistics will be given as to how well the question was answered, and some suggestions for centres going forward, especially on the common questions. So there are some questions that you will see coming up time and time again because they're key areas that we need in mathematics to carry going forward. Okay, so we're going to have a look first of all at section A and how to answer the multiple choice questions. I just picked one question as an example from the summer paper, and we have an example of a very straightforward multiple choice question where the candidates were asked to work out 8 add 3 multiplied by 7. Obviously here we're testing a skill of knowing which part of the work, so big mass order of operation, which part of this calculation they need to carry out first. And they're given 4 options of answers: 29, 31, 59 and 77. Each answer is relevant to potential misunderstanding. So as well as the correct answer, you'll see that the answers in the multiple choice questions are linked. There's always an explanation in the mark scheme as to where the other 3 options came from. So the instruction on the paper is to mark answers. The instruction for marking answers to the multiple choice questions is to put a cross, and it shows a cross, in the box to identify your answer. So we're expecting an X to be written in the box below. An answer which is left in the workspace cannot be marked by the computer and will score 0. Here we have an example. Candidate has written underneath 8 plus 21. So obviously the student knew they had to do 3 multiplied by 7 first, and they got 21, 8 plus 21, and then they've come up with 77. Might be that they've seen it below. It is an incorrect answer, so it wouldn't have scored. However, left like that, it can't be marked anyway. So even if they corrected it in their head, if they haven't checked a box underneath, it can't be marked. It's essential that we make sure that our students are well practiced in filling in these boxes. So we have another option now. If an answer is incorrectly marked, maybe they've put a circle around it. Again, the computer cannot pick up the scoring. So these first 20 questions are scanned through the computer, and the computer is looking for the check mark inside the box. So this bottom example, we have 29 as the correct answer, and we have it circled. If this was marked by an examiner, they would be able to mark that correctly. If it's marked by the computer, obviously, it is impossible for the computer to read or recognize that circling. So the box must be checked. Okay, so then we have, if the student's first attempt to answer this question. So they've set off trying to answer the question. They've added 8 add 3 because those digits came first, and then they've said they're going to multiply by 7. They've checked 77. So they've correctly marked the answer sheet. Obviously, it's an incorrect answer. The student attempts to correct their answer. They've realized they've done it wrong. They want to go back and try again. So they cross out their working, and they remember it's 8 add 21. So they check 29. In this example, we can see we have 2 answers. The computer can't mark 2 answers. It needs to know which of those 2 to mark. So the first answer that the candidate wrote must be crossed through, or the computer will see 2 and score it 0. So just to really get the message through here, we need students to be clearly crossing through. That 77 now has a horizontal line through it. That's picked up by the computer as not being part of the cross, and it will ignore it. It can then mark the 29. Hopefully, this has cleared up the ways of answering and changing answers on section A. It is something that we need to make sure is happening better. We don't want students missing out on marks because they circled an answer rather than putting a cross in the box, or they correct themselves and forget to cross out their first. So students really do need to be well practiced. Just 1 mark might be what costs them that grade. Okay, to move on to section B and have a look at some of the well answered questions. Some of the topics that we see regularly, or certainly that we saw in 2023, that were answered well. So first we're going to look at 1 mark questions, the single mark questions. Section B requires answers to be worked out and given on the answer line, or on a chart, or on a table of some sort. Here we have some examples of questions that were well answered. So, working with tally charts. Here we had a question where students needed to understand tallies and present their totals. It's a very early question, question 21. It's the first question in this section. So a low level question to move people in. Sorry, I've just paused there to go into chat just because it was relevant to that first section. I have a message from Jobo saying there's no audio. Could you check, Jobo? I will type a response to that. If a student has got the right answer in a third attempt, has crossed out 2 wrong answers already, will the third correct be marked? Yes, as long as the 2 incorrect, as long as anything that doesn't want to be marked by the computer has that horizontal line through it, they can change their mind obviously 3 times and then just leave the 1 check. The computer will just mark the clear cross and it will ignore anything that has a horizontal line through it. Audio is working. Computer reads any dark writing. If a student is writing in pencil, it needs to be a hard, heavy coloured pencil. Obviously, black is always the easiest because it shows up neatly for them. But also at this level, we like obviously to see the children being able to work in pencil. Sometimes pencil marks need to be really hard, so we would encourage black pen. Right, sorry, let's go back to the tally chart. So it's an early question. Tally chart was there. The student needed to understand how tallies work and present the total. This is usually a well answered area of interpreting data, and it's usually well understood. The crossed gates differentiates between the student who clearly does and doesn't understand this form of presenting data. So measuring angles. Students were asked to measure a size of an angle. It's very common to have some questions around angle sizes. Students were asked to measure the size of this angle. And in the summer of 2023, this answer was correct for over 60% of the students. It is an area that's been improving over recent times. And common difficulties that we see on measuring angles is students either not having a protractor and maybe guessing and estimating that angle, or the protractor not quite being used correctly. So not quite measuring from the beginning, or unfortunately reading the scale on a protractor the wrong way around. So use of protractor is something that we can improve on to ensure these angle measuring questions are successful. So the next 1 mark, very successful question, is multiplying and dividing by 10 and 100. Here there were 2 questions. They included decimals in the question. Obviously the first one there was multiplied by 10 and the second one dividing by 100. So making sure that the students are understanding the place value of the decimal point as these numbers are being increased or decreased in size. Another excellent topic in the summer, 75%, over 75% success on multiplying by 10 and understanding the place value of the decimal when you do so. And again, 65% for the dividing by 100. So reasonably early questions, not high demand at all, but skills that we really need our students to understand to be able to achieve going forward in their mathematics. We need to look at 2-mark questions. So we said earlier, 6 to 8 of the questions will be 2 marks. And this is where students are able to pick up a mark for understanding the method, understanding the processes that they need to go through. It's quite new to primary age students, obviously, that it's not just I got that question right, so I get the mark, I got that question wrong, so I don't. We have a good look at what they've done, and if there's some understanding there, just like with a GCSE question, if there's some understanding and there's some part of the process that they've managed to successfully achieve, then they can grab some marks for that. One of our best examples is our long multiplication question. So long multiplication is usually seen on all iPrimary assessment papers, although it doesn't have to be. It's not guaranteed that it's going to be there. But I think if we look back through past papers, we see that it is something that's checked very regularly. It's a skill that these students will take forward through life. It's also our first of 3 questions in the iPrimary specification, which insists on working being shown. Without working, no marks will be awarded. In 2023, we don't see an issue with that. In the early days of iPrimary and lower secondary, we saw regularly that students didn't like to show any working out. They liked to have completely neat, clear question papers just with an answer on the answer line. What we like to see as examiners is we like to see some working. In this respect, we need to see the working. So these students should be being encouraged all the time to write down in maths. Write it down. Let's see what's there. It appears that it's normally a 3 or 4 digit number multiplied by at least a 2-digit number so that they can set it out as long multiplication. We're looking obviously for one of those marks as a place value mark. And the mark scheme is set out to explain where the 2 marks are awarded. Mark scheme shows that the second mark, right down at the very bottom of the notes section, the accuracy mark is dependent on the method mark. So you see that written there. As a primary specialist myself, when I was in the classroom, I didn't spend a lot of time looking at the GCSE mark schemes. This is how we set it out at GCSE as well now. So the way it's written, A1 dependent on M1, so they can only achieve the accuracy mark if we see something that we can give the method mark for. So even if they've got a correct answer on the answer line, if there's no working out, these students don't get the mark. And we're quite strict with the examiners that that's how we need to mark it. Students need to know that these are progressive papers. It's how it will be marked at lower secondary, and it's how it will be marked at GCSE. So in long multiplication, they get the first mark for showing a complete and correct method with no place value errors. We always insist that there is no place value error. So if they carry out the method that would multiply 3,408 by 10, followed by 3,408 multiplied by 6, we need to see they're set out in a correct format. So we're looking for seeing the 2 separate multiplication answers. So if we see somewhere on the paper, in this example, 34,080, and we see 20,448, they can get that mark. We don't necessarily have to see where it comes from, but there's a step there showing us they've clearly worked those 2 out. There is a note on here that says they can be seen as jottings, or they can be seen from other methods. There's lots of methods that you can use for multiplication. It doesn't have to be a standard algorithm. There's usually the example of how The grid method can be used, even though we do see less and less of that these days. We're seeing more and more long multiplication algorithms. But there is an example of how the grid method will work there. So then we go on to division. Division is also a 2-mark question. Oh, I'll just go back to multiplication. In the summer of 2023, 83% of our iPrimary candidates gained at least 1 mark on the long multiplication question. 83% picked up 1 mark. Almost 70% of all students in the summer gained both marks on long multiplication. It's a question we're very proud that our centres are clearly teaching well and our students are understanding well. It's a very, very positive, well-answered question. So then we go on to division. There are a number of ways of assessing division. Commonly, it seems that we're using a larger 2-digit divisor to make sure the concept of division has been understood. In this paper, we actually assess the ability to work with the remainder. So we just use a single digit divisor because we're not just assessing the ability to understand division, we were also assessing the ability to understand what happened when there was something left over. We have a lot more detail in the mark scheme for division so that centres and teachers can see how the marks are awarded. It's exactly the same as multiplication. This is our second question where we see a dependency on a method. So we can't award for a correct answer unless we see some working. And in this respect, we show exactly how far we expect the first step of division to go. So we need to see in short division, the 9 with 1 correctly placed between the 7 and the 5 to show that there was 15 left. In the long division algorithm, that's more clear. This is always shown on a mark scheme so that we know how it works. Centres can see exactly what we're looking for. Again, success rate in division in 2023. In the summer, 80% of students gained at least 1 mark. 60% of them gained both marks on that question. Very, very well answered. Some more concepts we will go through quickly that are well understood. Mean is well understood. Students need to know sorry, I'm just answering the text chat to Jobo, who still can't hear. Okay, so concept that's understood, but many were let down here by their arithmetic skills. They're quite big numbers. There's quite a few of them, but you will see that there are some quite obvious ways of being able to do the calculation. There's a few 5s, there's a 6 and a 4. So they weren't difficult numbers to work with. It's a non-calculator paper. We didn't stress that at the beginning. So we are expecting written arithmetic, which is why we say that we need to see the working out. So the first mark required a fully correct method, which meant we needed to see all 7 numbers added together and the division by 7. The second mark was given for the correct answer. In order to gain the first mark, we needed to see something written down that added 25, add 26, add 24, add 25, add 28, add 29, add 25. They didn't have to be in that order, but we needed to see all 7 added and a division by 5. Simply, you could have put an addition sign between all those numbers, drawn the division line, a 7 underneath. It would show a clear method of how you would get a correct answer. If we see that those 7 numbers have been added correctly, the correct answer was 182, or is 182. If that student had miscalculated and maybe got 181, any number at all, and shown division by 7 and realized that maybe they weren't quite going right because it didn't work for them, we could still award that first mark because we saw the full process, all 7 added and the division by 7. It's how they pick up a method mark. And with the example of mean, again, we said it was arithmetic that was letting them down. So volume. Volume is something, it's a concept that was well understood. Our volume question this time involved the students needing to understand units. Because we were assessing units as well as the concept of volume, we use simple numbers. So 3 centimeters, 4 centimeters, 2 centimeters. It's a part way through the paper question. So we're looking at that second level, slightly more demand because more skills have got to be remembered. But the mark scheme here shows us that 1 mark is given for the 24. So the understanding that we need to do 3 multiplied by 4 multiplied by 2. And the second mark is given for the centimeters cubed. So a mark there for understanding that when you're working in volume, you're working in this case, centimeters cubed. So getting the correct unit. It's a good question. Our students did well on it in the summer. Okay, then we need to have a quick look at some of the weaker questions. I am quite conscious of the time. Calculations of angles. Here we were given a diagram of angles around a point, even though the more able students might have realized that there was an unmarked right angle due to AB being a straight line. This wasn't required knowledge at this point. Because AB is a straight line, the line equaled 180 degrees was actually the fact that they required. The principal examiner's report here explained, surprisingly, only half of the students were able to correctly work out the size of the angle shown, with students incorrectly subtracting 42 from 90 or 360 rather than 180. It's a common set out of the question. Sometimes there's just the line with the angle on it. Sometimes it's shown as angles around a point. So we need to make sure that our students are realizing that the straight line is 180, the whole angles around a point is 360. Just lots of repetition on that one. Naming angles. Centres need to ensure that students know the names and can recognise the different angles. These are listed in the specification. They're also listed in the curriculum document. The angles that they are required at iPrimary to know the names of. something, it's a recall skill that they just need to be well rehearsed with. Another weak question that we find coming up is adding fractions together. The example that we've had in the summer was a mixed number added to a fraction, but with a common denominator. Principal examiner's report in the summer explained that adding fractions is improving. It definitely is improving. Our percentages are going up. However, it is still an area which needs more understanding. So here we were adding fractions with a common denominator, although there was the mixed number. There were various ways of tackling the question, and there were various ways of gaining the mark. Correct answer got them the 2 marks for this question. If they didn't manage to pick up the correct answer, then they could get 1 mark if they knew one of 2 things. One was to be able to change the mixed number into an improper fraction. So 2 3/5 would become 13/5. And if we saw 13/5, they got that 1 mark. The other way of getting that 1 mark was realizing that they didn't actually have to work with the 2 initially. Fractions had a common denominator. They could add them together. So 3/5 add 4/5 was 7/5. If we saw 7/5, they got that first mark. The biggest problem we saw moving on from that first mark was students leaving their answer as 2 7/5. 2 7/5 would gain them 1 mark, but as it wasn't simplified, it didn't score them the second mark. We needed to see those 7/5 reduced down to 1 2/5 and added on to the 2 so that it was a full addition process. It's nice to see that adding fractions is improving. We need some more work, lots of practice to get through there. Algebra. It's a difficult concept. It is on the specification and it will be assessed. Sometimes it's assessed at a much higher level. It's right at the end of the paper. It's a P3 level question. It's a medium demand question. It's pulling out those higher achieving students, but it will be there. And there's lots of different ways to assess it. This one was expand and simplify. It's a common topic at lower secondary. It's a common topic at IGCSE. It's one that they need to grasp. Sometimes it's a difficult question, penultimate question on the paper. We use a common mark scheme. We use the same mark scheme across the board. The first mark is gained by expanding either one of the brackets correctly in this example, or for expanding and simplifying one of the terms correctly. The second mark is given for a fully correct answer. It's definitely an improving topic. It's pleasing to see. At this level, we are only expecting those top level students, and we're seeing them achieving well there. Takes us on to factors. There were 2 joining questions on this, 2 joining parts on this question. Students are becoming better at understanding the term factors, and they usually manage to list a few of the factors. We don't often see all factors listed. This probably is because students are just grasping and guessing at the factors that are there. So we need to think about how we can systematically work through factors to ensure that we've got them all. Using factor pairs would be a really, really useful way of getting these students to list all of the factor pairs, starting at one end of the number, either starting with 48 doing division or going up from 1 doing multiplication, but listing factor pairs. When we ask them to list the factors, they don't have to be in numerical order. So if they listed factor pairs here as 1 and 48, 2 and 24, that's 4 of the factors that they've listed, and they're correct. That's for the examiners to work out how many of them are correct and to check them for them carefully. Highest common factor was answered less well. Only around half the students understood the highest common factor. The second number for highest common factor is always a bit easier, so that they don't have to work out very many factors to be able to pick it out. But to find the highest factor that is common to both of the numbers is something that they will need going forward. And the factor question on this one, they could get 1 mark for listing at least 6 correct factors of 48. They needed 9 or 10 of them to get the full marks. For the full marks, we don't allow any incorrect or repeated answers. For the second, just for the 1 mark, they are allowed 1 incorrect in there. I'm going to have a quick look at a week 3 mark question. It's quite a useful one for us to look at. It's presenting data, and presenting data always seems to be a bit of a struggle. So as mentioned earlier, as well as the 1 or 2 mark questions, there's always the final question, which is problem solving, which is 3 marks, and usually an extra 3 mark question in the paper. This is regularly on presenting data because there's regularly more parts to the question that we need to look for. Summer of 2023. This was a breakdown of the success rate on the presenting data question. Only 28% of all students gained all 3 marks. 15% didn't gain any marks at all. It was a bar chart question. It goes back to that tally chart that we looked at right at the beginning, and we asked the students to provide us with a bar chart to represent the information off their tally chart. Looking at the mark scheme for it, at the bottom there, 1 mark was awarded separately for each of the 3 parts: the linear scale, the correct labelling on the axes, and the correct bar height. So a bar chart is fairly easy way of presenting data. They'd got their information from the tally chart and they were drawing it onto bars. Right in the middle there, the principal examiner's report explained that the vast majority did label the x-axis correctly, but omitted to label the y-axis sufficiently. They need to be able to explain what both sides of their bar chart are showing us. Using a linear scale also proved difficult, with around half of the students placing numbers next to the boxes and not next to the lines. So we need to move on from a box representing, as in a pictogram, to the line is where we measure. And obviously there, we need the scale to start at 0. And many of the students started the scale normally at 1. So we need to know that bottom line shows us that there's nothing there. If the bottom line shows 1, then we can't show a bar for 0. So students need to be encouraged to use their linear scale beginning at 0. But most students did manage to pick up at least 1 mark on the bar chart. But data is something that centres must rehearse with their students. And again, let me direct you to the spec to make sure that all types of presenting data are being covered in the class. So the other weak question was the problem solving question. If we look at the statistics, this wasn't as bad as some years. So we do see only 39% of our students gained that full 3 marks for this question. It's the final question on the paper. Sometimes it's a really difficult one to grasp the understanding of. The final question is always 3 marks problem solving. And it can assess any area of the curriculum. So again, the data showed that students do struggle with this type of question. Problem solving is improving. The data still showed that almost a quarter of our students didn't score at all on this question. Less than 50% gained 2 or 3 marks. As it's problem solving, there's usually numerous approaches to solving it. Here, the mark scheme showed us 2 different methods or approaches to tackling this. The principal examiner's report did explain a little about where the marks were lost and gained. So it explained that a mixture of approaches were used, using percentages or a combination of the 2. Most candidates either got the 60 or the 70 or the 55% and picked up 1 mark. Many recognised 25% as a quarter and effectively calculated 30% of 240. They usually did that by first calculating 10, which was encouraging, so 10% of 240, and then added it together 3 times or multiplying it by 3. Often students found correct percentages of 240, getting the total of 132, but failed to realise this wasn't the number of students who walked. So the only way that we can improve on problem solving is to rehearse problem solving. It's there, it will be on every paper. It needs to be practiced. Sorry, Nazir, I've only just seen your question. Does it matter if there are spaces or not between bars on a bar chart? Not at all. We don't assess the gaps between the bars. We're assessing it's on the mark scheme. We're looking for a linear scale. We're looking for correct bar heights, and we're looking for correctly labeled axes at this level. So as long as they've got those labels to tell us what they're showing us, and they've got their scale correct, and they've managed to present their bar on their chart. If we see a gap between, one and not a gap between the other, that's fine. We're looking for those 3 things. We're not looking at the gaps. Obviously, you teach them and then they present it how they do. But no, we just look for those 3. So a quick comparison to November's paper. November's paper performed very differently this year. There were some common questions which appeared in one form or another through the paper, but there were also some which haven't been seen for a while. So the first point there, reading and writing numbers. Students were able to write numbers which had appeared in digits into words or vice versa. Very, very well answered question. Again, it was an early question, low demand, something we expect most of our students to do. Over 90% success rate on both looking at a 4-digit number, 5-digit number, and writing it out in words, or reading the words, converting it into digits. Absolutely excellent. Over 90% success rate on both of those parts of the question. Recognizing and being able to use less than or greater than, again, showed a high success rate, with most students gaining marks on understanding them. It seemed that the marks that were lost were really obvious, where a student had used them the wrong way around. Again, practice repetition, and just recall. But the lost marks on that one were just the error of getting them the wrong way around. Converting between fractions, decimals, and percentages in November was excellent, with over 80% of students achieving at least one of the 2 marks available on that question for converting between a given fraction, a given decimal, or a given percentage, and ensuring that the table was complete for all 3 ways of writing. It was very pleasing to see. And then algebra. Well answered algebra questions we're happy with. Understanding and calculating the nth term, it's not easy. It's high, medium demand, P3 question, right at the end of the paper. But we saw a 10% increase in success on finding the nth term. So students were given the nth term equation, they were asked to find the 12th. 50% from the principal examiner's report, 50% of students gained the mark for finding the nth term in part B. Of the incorrect attempts, many gave 48 as their answer. They understood the 4 times 12, then forgot to deal with the -1. But great improvement. Again, algebra is difficult, but it's improving. Some of the weaker questions that we saw. Now, if you notice, measuring angles came up as one of the well-answered questions in the summer. So these were further weak questions from November compared to the summer, with some surprising examples. Measuring the angle in November was given, students were asked to measure the size of the angle given on a diagram rather than just on a straight line, and this proved difficult. What we're seeing is that maybe students are only rehearsing one way of doing something when clearly there are other ways. So here they had to measure the size of angle X inside the box, and it clearly threw them. Only a quarter of students gained this mark compared to over 60% in the summer. This was raised in the principal examiner's report again. So really useful document at the end of an exam period. It was surprising to see how few students gained this mark. Measuring an angle is an extremely common question. Many students are still reading the protractor scale incorrectly, giving the acute value. So they obviously gave the opposite value to the one that they were measuring. So reading the scale backwards, not recognizing the angle they had measured was obtuse and larger than 90. It is essential that students have correct measuring tools and that they have been taught to use them correctly. So the principal examiner's report is there. It's guiding you through errors that were made, success, and suggestions moving forward. So we raised adding fractions worked well in the summer. It was almost an identical question, just different fraction sizes. Only 47% gained 1 mark in November compared to 76% gaining at least 1 mark in the summer. The question was marked exactly the same. Mark scheme allowed for obviously either the conversion of the mixed number or the addition of the 2 fractions for 1 mark, and then the combining and simplifying for the 2nd mark. We saw again 2 and 10/8, so not dealing with the 10/8 for the final answer. So, even though we saw a bigger drop in success, there's still a lot of positives for adding fractions, just some more practice required. So more or less the same there as I've just said. Many stopped at 2 10/8, which gained them the method mark, however, lost them the accuracy mark. The two big concerns in November, after we said how high long multiplication and division succeeded in the summer, was the low rate. So long multiplication appears, I mean, this is straight off the principal examiner's report. It's one of the questions where working must be seen. Most students are correctly approaching the long multiplication algorithm. It's pleasing to see that students are giving their answer with working. Disappointing to see the number of students who had both rows of multiplication incorrect. Okay, fewer students were making place value errors, which was encouraging, but it appears that it's the arithmetic at this level that's letting the students down. So centres need to ensure that students can practice basic arithmetic without a calculator for both multiplication and division. You know, we see what's almost the hard part, both steps of the multiplication correct, and then the final addition incorrect, losing them that extra mark. Compared with the summer of 83% success, in November, this dropped to 60. So we need to practice. It may be because of the school year timings. And then we looked at division. Similar to multiplication, division is another common question, again requiring working to be seen. Students are able to approach the question using whichever method they find comfortable. Majority of them are now using long division algorithm, which is nice to see. Students attempting to show they're working. Unfortunately, only around 25% in November gained full marks in this series. Again, the comment at the bottom there, directions to centres to ensure that students have skill to tackle this type of question without the aid of a calculator. So they know how to do actual longhand versions of these calculations. It's a normally very, very well answered question. So that brings us towards the end of the session, just overrunning a few minutes, with a list of areas looking through 2023's papers where we think centres could work on improving. I think with the long introduction at the beginning to the setting out and how to change the answers and making sure that they're presented correctly, multiple choice questions hopefully will score better for us. Students need to be well practiced in placing the cross in the answer box. They need to be taught how to change their answers. We all know at this age, you can tell them a million times, showing them, cross it out, put that line through the middle, make sure the computer knows what you want them to mark. The computer can't read your writing, it can only read your cross. As many ways as we can practice with them, get them used to answering them. There are multiple choice questions on the ILO secondary paper as well, so that is a skill that they will take forward. Using units of measure. We need to encourage students to always use the relevant units of measure, no matter what type of question they're answering. In measure-related questions, if no units are given, then they will most likely be a mark for the correct units. So whether they're measuring a line, whether they're working out an area, whether they're working out a perimeter, whether they're working out a volume, get them used to putting a unit down. They'll never be penalised for putting the unit if the unit's given. So sometimes on a volume question, the unit would be given at the side of the answer line, and we're just looking for maybe a more difficult volume to be worked out. If they wrote centimetres cubed and centimetres cubed was given, they wouldn't be penalised. If they wrote centimetres squared and centimetres cubed was given, that would be passed on to a senior examiner who would look at the working and see if it was just a general error, but get them used to putting the units down. Algebra. Algebra is assessed in all series. It's normally the penultimate question. From what we can see in past papers, centres need to ensure that students are covering the areas identified in the spec. Okay, the specification and the curriculum document are there with examples. They will be assessed. They might not always be assessed, but they will be assessed through various papers in various series. Measuring accuracy. Students need to be well rehearsed in measuring accuracy. They especially need to know the correct starting point on a ruler. Many students are still starting, or they're getting their answer about 5 millimeters wrong on a measuring question, which to an examiner shows that they're probably starting at the beginning of the ruler rather than at the first mark on the ruler. And the correct direction of measuring with a protractor. 2 skills that will pick them up some marks quite quickly. Going forward, will keep their accuracy as they progress through their mathematics levels. Angles. Students need to be able to recognise and name the properties of angles. They also need to be able to accurately measure and calculate sizes of angles. They need to know properties of 2 and 3D shapes. It was an area of the specification that demonstrated more reinforcement was needed through 2023's papers. So I am going quite quickly through these improvement areas. I know you will be sent this presentation, so they will be there for you. Proportion. Proportion was an area that showed that centres needed to ensure was being covered in the ratio and proportion aspect of the specification. Ratio comes up quite regularly as a question. Just looking at sharing something in a ratio between 2 people. Proportion, slightly more difficult skill. Again, it's something that needs to be practiced and usually practiced in context. And then we get to problem solving. Problem solving at this stage is a difficult skill to master. Students will only improve at this type of question if they are exposed to situations where they must apply mathematical knowledge in order to solve a particular problem. So problem solving is essential as we go forward into the higher levels, into the lower secondary paper, into IGCSE. Problem solving is becoming more common, more writing, more deciphering, more trying to be able to apply their knowledge. And then equipment. It is essential that students have their own equipment. It's specified on the front cover of the assessment paper. This paper asks for a ruler, protractor, compasses and tracing paper. Compasses, yes, we do use construction in some questions. It's on the spec, so they need to be able to know how to use them. But the ruler, protractor, tracing paper for rotations. And that brings us to the end of the feedback for 2023. I believe